is the Truth Frequency Radio Network.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories.
Because it is not the government of the people any longer.
Circus ridiculous.
A new world order. A world where the rule of law governs the conduct of nations.
Most people do not understand the Illuminati.
It's all about control.
Conspiracy theories.
It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations.
A new world order.
Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised.
It's the Weekend Vigilante Show.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Weekend Vigilante Show here on TFRN. I'm your host, Sheila Zielinski, for Wednesday, June 18th. I have a powerful, hard-hitting guest, Dr. Chuck Baldwin, a prolific writer, conservative pastor, and radio talk show host. He was the Constitution Party's presidential candidate for 2008 election. As a Republican Party member, Baldwin was a state chair of the Florida Moral Majority in the 1980s. Baldwin strongly opposes the New World Order, the United Nations, U.S. income taxes, the Patriot Act, and assaults on individual liberties in general. He strongly supports the gold standard, the right to bear and keep arms, homeschooling, and pro-life legislation such as the Sanctity of Life Act. He's a man of God on a mission, and he's a 1-2 punch to the Luciferian elite. He's my kind of guy, and buckle up, folks. Dr. Chuck Baldwin, welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you, Sheila. It's good to be with you.
Chuck, it is so great to finally have you on. Listen, you wrote an article a while back about how today's preachers have become all but neutered and how Christians should not obey. And even though you've long maintained that the abject apathy and indifference with today's churchmen is ubiquitous, and they are not merely content to not being involved, they're absolutely committed to not being involved. You said it went much deeper than apathy. It was apostasy. After you wrote that, Chuck, inbox was filled with virulent rebukes from pastors and Christians. And when you read asinine statements like, if federal agents or troops came to my house and put my wife on the kitchen table and raped her, Romans 13 tells me I could not interfere, or this one's a classic, if government forces came to my house intent on harming my wife and children, I would not resist. I'd simply tell my family to run. America's founding fathers are rebels against God. They had no right to fight a war for independence. Subjection to a king, even a tyrannical one, is God's will. How stunned, Chuck, or maybe shocked is a better word, were you over the replies of so-called Christians to this article?
Well, those quotes that you just mentioned are quotes that I have actually heard. And I don't know that stunned is the word anymore, Sheila. I think that, unfortunately, what you read there is pretty much the thinking of the vast majority of our clergymen and pastors around the country. Many of them may not say it quite as openly as those did that you just quoted, but the feeling is pretty much the same. So I can't say that I was shocked or stunned. I was deeply saddened, and you know, it's hard to imagine that the descendants of Jonas Clark and the great patriot pastors of colonial America are where they are today in this country. And quite frankly, I don't think we would be where we are as a country with all the things going on that we're aware of, except for the fact that the pastors, for the most part, are absolutely mute and silent and will not speak. I think the church has always had the opportunity, the power, the position to set the course of the country. And unfortunately, the pastors are not They're not setting a course at all. They're letting the other side set the course. So it's just a commentary on where the church is today.
Well, you've said that there's absolutely no doubt in your mind, Chuck, that the biggest reason America's in the mess that they're in today is directly due to this apathy and indifference of the American pulpit. I like what Steve Quayle calls this the silent devil pulpiteers. It's always crickets chirping in the mega churches on all the big issues. Is it not? Weigh in on that, Chuck.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And it's not just the big churches either. You go to the average-sized church in America and you see the same thing. I think that the churches, by and large, have made a conscious decision to stay out of anything controversial. And there's nothing that is more controversial than politics. And couple that with the misinterpretation of Romans 13 and the 501c3 tax-exempt status of the IRS, and the pastors and churches are just totally, absolutely determined that they will not involve themselves in any of these things. Like you quoted me as saying a few moments ago, this is more than apathy. It is a deliberate decision to stay uninvolved.
I so agree. And it seems that every time someone such as yourself attempts to encourage our Christian brothers and sisters to resist an unconstitutional or other reprehensible government policy, we hear this retort, what about Romans chapter 13? We Christians must submit to government. I mean, would you agree that for the most part, Romans 13 is their escape clause from responsibility? Because this submit to government, no matter what nonsensical interpretation of Romans 13, that is taught and preached by the vast majority of today's pastors and churches in America is really the same devilish doctrine that Hitler promoted during the Nazi regime.
Yes, absolutely right. And that's why my constitutional attorney son and I wrote a book not too long ago called Romans 13, The True Meaning of Submission. We tried to address this for the very reasons that you just described. And what we try to do is show that not just Romans 13, but the entire body of Scripture, Old and New Testament, nowhere teaches that Christians are to submit to evil, wicked authority, no matter what kind of authority it is. And to say otherwise is literally, in my opinion, is to commit idolatry, because there's only one sovereign, and that is not government. It is the Creator God. Jesus said, all power, authority is given unto me in heaven and earth. He is the only sovereign. And to give to civil government that kind of authority and power, where that you would submit to it, no matter how egregiously evil it might be, is the height of idolatry. It is to supplant the authority of the Creator God and to replace it with human authority. All human authority is limited and jurisdictional in nature, whether it's the authority of the home or civil authority or business, whatever kind of authority it is, it's limited and jurisdictional. A father, a single mother has authority in the home, but that authority is not unlimited. A father or husband does not have the God-given right to physically abuse his wife or his children, to beat them senseless and to abuse them. There's no one in their right mind that would say that a father or a husband has the right to do that because they have authority in the family. A pastor has authority in the church, but he can't dictate to the individual families what to do in their private lives, or the businessmen of his church how to run their businesses. His authority is limited. It is jurisdictional. Same thing is true with a civil government. They have authority under God, but that is limited and jurisdictional in nature. And when they overstep the boundaries in the jurisdiction that God has rightly given them, they become tyrannical in nature. And to submit to tyranny is to become an idolater, is to make a god out of whatever that governing institution might be. And that's what these preachers are doing. I don't know whether they're really thinking about it plainly and thoroughly, but that is exactly what they are doing. And then to comment on what you said about the comparison between the teaching today and in Nazi Germany, you're exactly right.
You were talking about your son and you created a book, and I'd really like you to give my listeners an overview of that book, because I think this is a really important topic, especially for today's church. I mean, I'm very concerned about the state of affairs in the church today. It is concerning the spiritual state of the church, is it not, Chuck?
Oh, absolutely. It affects, I think, the very soul of the church. Yeah, it wasn't too long ago, I'm not sure, maybe a year or two ago, my son and I were discussing the vacuum that exists today among the churches, and we saw as one of the biggest reasons for that the misinterpretation of Romans chapter 13. And so we put together what I think is a very comprehensive book on the subject. And we not only deal with Romans chapter 13, because when Paul wrote that chapter, he was not introducing anything new whatsoever. The principle of submission to authority is as old as the Old Testament. So we went into the Scriptures, Old Testament and New Testament, the complete body of scriptural evidence, and we showed what the scriptural teaching is. And the scriptural teaching is that the sovereign God has given to mankind, for the purpose of order and civilization and safety and so forth and so on, limited jurisdictional authority to men. It's called government. But there's not just one form of government. And most people think when you say the word government, you're talking about civil government. But government could be any number of things. There's the government of the family. A father and mother and children in the home constitute family government. And there are all kinds of responsibilities and duties that God has given to family government. There's employer government or vocational government, where that businessmen, business owners have a responsibility in the way they conduct the affairs of their business, the way they treat their employees, the way employees are to treat their employers. And there's great scriptural teaching on that subject. There is church authority, ecclesiastical authority, where you have church officers and pastors with duties and responsibilities, and the congregation, the parishioners, have duties and responsibilities. And all of that is outlined in the Scripture. So when you get to civil government, that's just one form of government. And the same principle applies to civil government that applies to all other forms of government. Whoever the authority figure is has a responsibility and a duty and an obligation to do certain things under the authority of God. They cannot abuse their position. They have no right to do that. To do so is considered criminal in nature. And there are repercussions and ramifications for those who abuse their authority. That's true of parents, it's true of employers, it's true of pastors, and it's true of governors. Any authority that transgresses the duties and responsibilities that are given it by the sovereign God have to pay the price of that abuse. And so to think that in Romans 13, God is telling us that we are to submit in an unlimited fashion to civil government is to ignore the plain body of evidence relative to all human authority. In fact, in Romans 13, it even specifies some of the duties that God has given to civil government, such as the government is not a terror unto good works, but unto evil. So there is a responsibility, there is a boundary, there is a parameter that God has given to civil government. God has said, okay, those of you in leadership in civil government, you must not abuse your authority. You must not terrorize good works. So whenever human government steps over that boundary, that jurisdictional parameter that God has established, and they become a terror to good works, is Paul the Apostle saying that we are supposed to submit to that tyrannical government? No, absolutely not. Just the opposite. Paul is telling the government, you have no right to terrorize good works. You must govern within the responsibility that I have given you. And that's true throughout the entire body of Scripture. So we wrote the book to try and show that nowhere in the Scripture does God demand that Christians, or anyone else for that matter, submit to wicked, evil authority that has overstepped the boundaries that God has created for it? And in fact, to do so is an act of idolatry, because what it does, it attributes to whatever the authority figure is, in this case the civil government, an attribute of sovereignty that is reserved exclusively for the Creator God. And so I don't know if these preachers are just not thinking it through, if they don't want to think it through, or what the issue is. But when they tell their people that they are to submit to human government, even if human government is evil and wicked, etc., which is exactly what they're saying, they are committing sacrilege. They are literally promoting idolatry, and they are making an idol out of civil government. It cannot be stressed too much, the error of this misinterpretation, and the result of which, of course, is the utter indifference, apathy, and, dare I say, subjugation of the church to evil, wicked men.
Well, you're absolutely right, Chuck, and I like what you say about the limits to authority and how it is a good example. A father, a husband, has authority in his home, but does that give him power to abuse his wife and children? No, of course not. Again, a pastor has an overseer authority in the church, but this doesn't give him power to tell employers in his church how to run their business. And all human authority really is limited in nature. No man has unlimited authority over the lives of men, and I think it's contrary to a lot of people's beliefs. Even the Supreme Court is not the highest judge in the land, as most people will say. But we're going to go to a quick break here, Chuck, and in the next segment we'll jump back into that topic, subjugation. You've got that right. Plundering and pillaging, because, Chuck, I can only use pirate terms here to describe what's unfolding. We've moved from this soft, ambiguous tyranny to a more aggressive, full-out dictatorial, tyrannical imperialism. Thousands of unconstitutional regulations, thousands of presidential fiats, domestic spying, a draconian police state, presidential fiat, IRS abuses, prosecutorial abuses, refusal to execute laws, changing laws. The list goes on and on to the point of nausea, and we're being systematically dehumanized, and we're being taught to love our servitude while the clandestine oligarchs usurp our freedoms and exert this full spectrum dominance over every area of our lives. It's sit down, shut up, do what you're told, and don't dare question your government, or you're a terrorist. I mean, a militarized police, body scanners, citizen spies, sound cannons, drones, stage terrors, massive psyops. There's cameras on every street corner. Big Brother meets draconian police state. But the more disturbing thing to me, Chuck, is there is an outright attack on the Christianity. There's a butchering of our brethren, the attack on our family, our kids, our marriage, our church, our values, our education system. Look at any primetime TV lineup, and I mean, it's like Sodom and Gomorrah on steroids, concurrent to all this other stuff. It's really playing out like a bad Twilight Zone episode. Would you agree with that?
Very, very well put and articulate. Thank you, Sheila. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I really have to fault the church. And when I say that, I point the finger at my fellow pastors, because literally it is the church, it is the pulpit that sets the compass for the country. It is the conscience, the heart, the soul of the country. The things you describe would not be happening had not the churches so many years ago acquiesced and surrendered their responsibility to be the watchman on the wall. When I look at the conditions today, they are, I think, so analogous to the conditions of colonial America whenever our founding fathers fought the War of Independence. I think that there's so many similarities. And while all the things that you described are very real, and they have so many ominous signs on the horizon, but at the same time, there's some very encouraging signs too. There's a lot more people that are waking up to these realities today than there were even just a few years ago. I remember when I was running for president in 2008 on the Constitution Party ticket, that the level of awareness then was nowhere near what it is today. I can honestly say that. There are, I think, so many positive things that are happening. In the states, there are state legislators, there are the state senators that are beginning to awaken to the federal abuse of power, for example, trying to pass legislation to return sovereignty to the states, the constitutional jurisdictional federalism that was created in the Constitution. They are trying to re-implement. The state of Utah, for example, just passed a bill, the governor signed it, reclaiming some 30 million acres from the federal government within the boundaries of the state of Utah. There was a conference that was held in Salt Lake City by about 50 state legislators around the western states that were collaborating on how the respective states can begin to stand and reclaim state sovereignty in the face of federal abuse of power. There's a lot of good things that are happening. The biggest difference between what I see going on today and what the founding generation had in colonial America was the patriot pulpit. They had the patriot pulpit. We don't.
Right.
For the vast majority of cases, the pastors of all denominations in colonial America, they were bold and courageous in their proclamation of liberty. They taught the principles of liberty from the Bible. They gave their parishioners the courage, the inspiration, the instruction. Let me pause myself and give you an example. Most of us are very familiar with the day, April 19, 1775. That's the day the shot was fired, heard around the world. Okay, we're familiar with the story, but what we are not familiar with is the real truth of the men that stood on Lexington Green. And the truth is, the vast majority of those men were from the congregation of the Church of Lexington. The pastor of that church was Jonas Clark. Jonas Clark was a man who had pastored in that church for some 2 decades. He taught and preached the fundamental principles of liberty to his church during all his pastorate. He was very much involved in the liberty movement and the independence movement. Well, whenever the Crown sent its soldiers to Concord, they were sent to do 2 things. They were sent to seize the cache of firearms that were stored in Concord. And secondly, they were sent to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock. Now, they knew that they were in the area. They didn't know exactly where, but I'll tell you where they were. They were in Pastor Clark's home. He was keeping them there. Whenever the message came from Joseph Warren, medical doctor in Boston, via Paul Revere, that the British were coming to Concord, they had to go through Lexington. Pastor Clark knew that he had to protect those 2 patriots, John Hancock and Sam Adams. Some of his men took the 2 patriot leaders away from Lexington and ushered them into safety away from the British troops. At the same time, about 70 of Pastor Clark's male congregants from the Church of Lexington assembled themselves in the pre-dawn hours on the green. Now, when I say the green, it was the front lawn of the church where they worshiped every Sunday. So these 70 men were members of the Church of Lexington, Pastor Jonas Clark. They were the ones that when the British arrived in the pre-dawn hours and they saw those 70 men standing there with their muskets laid across their arms, and of course immediately the British opened fire, killed instantly 8 of those men, and then that's whenever they marched on toward Concord, and then the colonists from the surrounding areas around Lexington and Concord amassed at the North Bridge in Concord, and that's when the real battle took place, and we know all that story. The thing I'm trying to point out is that the men that stood on Lexington Green, where the shot was fired, heard around the world, starting our war for independence, were mostly the men of one church congregation. Now, compare that to the kind of pastors we have today. Can you imagine that happen, or any semblance of that happening in the 95% of the churches across America today, where they're being taught to submit to evil, to lay down their arms? If the government requires you to surrender your firearms, then you should surrender your firearms. If the government requires you to relocate in a national emergency, then you should relocate. You must do whatever the federal government tells you to do. The message that's preached in 95% of the churches of America today is that message. The encouraging signs are there, but what we don't have today that they had in colonial America is the patriot pulpit. And that's one of the reasons I'm in the Liberty Church Project now and trying to resurrect and reawaken the patriot pulpits of America. That's why we wrote the book on Romans 13. That's why my son and I wrote the book, To Keep or Not to Keep, Why Christians Should Not Give Up Their Guns, et cetera, et cetera. If we do not see an awakening of the patriot pulpit in America today, I don't think there is any hope outside of that.
You got that right. It is a spiritual battle, and these 501c3 organized incorporated churches refuse to make the scriptures relevant to the important matters in today and in life. And the standoff, I think, Chuck, we saw a while back between the Bundy Ranch and the BLM feds is a visceral example of growing discontent over an expanded federal government. And it's a perfect storm illustration of this arbitrary and incompetent federal government running roughshod over its citizens, and the steady erosion of personal wealth and liberty have been the result. But the Clive and Bundy showdown, to me, that's sort of the last rancher standing. It really represented a bigger systematic problem. Chuck, why are BLM agents carrying guns? What are federal employees doing carrying guns? You see agency after bureaucratic agency being armed. They're supposed to serve we the people. So while they're disarming the American people, and you've got Hillary Clinton yesterday saying, we cannot anymore support these few pro-Second Amendment. I mean, why are we arming federal employees while we're disarming the American people? What's wrong with that picture?
Yeah, well, what's wrong with that is what we're seeing is the creation of a police state right in front of our very eyes. That's what's wrong with it. The Clive and Bundy situation, of course, you know that I was down there.
Yes.
And, just explain to your listeners the real impetus for what happened there. The legal battle between Mr. Bundy and BLM has been going on for 20 years. This was not new. And the reason that if you want to call them militiamen, the citizen militia went down to Bunkerville, Nevada in support of Clive and Bundy had nothing to do with the court battle. It had nothing to do with the wrangling and the legalities and all. I mean, this has been going on for so long, and there was no standoff, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Now, that is a battle that Mr. Bundy has to face, like we all have to face when we get involved in these legal challenges, in courts of law, et cetera, et cetera. What happened was the video of the BLM agents who came to Bunkerville like stormtroopers, and they started throwing pregnant women and elderly women on the ground, sicking these attack dogs on innocent women and people. When they saw the innocent people being tased by BLM agents and being threatened with death, and they saw BLM snipers on the ground, training their weapons on women and children and elderly men, unarmed people that were just going about their daily lives. And when they saw that abuse of power, and with the memory of Waco and Ruby Ridge still fresh in our conscience and in our psyche, I think it was that, in fact, I know it was that image, it was those pictures and videos that rallied almost 1,000 people to come to the assistance of this man, not to engage and cast judgment on the court system or any of the legal wrangling that's still going on, and it'll go on for much longer. But it was to show that the American people were not going to sit back and allow a out-of-control federal bureaucracy to murder innocent American citizens like they did at Waco and Ruby Ridge. And to the question of why the BLM is armed in the beginning, that's absolutely a legitimate question. BLM is not a law enforcement agency. There's so many, what in the world is the post office doing storing arms? We've got NASA storing arms. So many of these federal bureaucracies that have no law enforcement assignment ascribed to them in any shape, manner, or form, are arming themselves to the teeth. And I think that that bodes the question that you just asked. And I think that at some point, the people of this country and the representatives of the people of this country in not only the state houses but also the federal houses of Congress are going to have to start addressing that issue.
Well, and I think we recognize that tyranny will tighten its grip. And as you so very articulately said, you talked about Lexington Minutemen. I mean, as Lexington Minutemen knew, the people will tolerate it for a long time, but at a critical point, that tolerance ceases and the people do stand up. Do you think this Clive and Bundy is maybe a slight flint of hope that maybe the American people are ready to fight to take back their country, Chuck?
Oh, I think that what happened in Bunkerville was a victory that is really hard to overstate. I think it totally surprised BLM and their handlers. I don't think they were prepared for that at all. And I think that it's going to change the rules of engagement from now on. I think that the federal agencies of whatever alphabet you want to call it will now have to think in much different terms. I think they now seen that the American people are not going to allow these federal agencies to just roll them over like they're serfs of slaves and subjects. Yeah, I really cannot overstate what happened down there and the bravery of those people on that Saturday that stood in front of those agents and the agents telling them point blank that they were going to shoot and kill them.
These guys at Clown News Network were actually propagating these guys as out-of-control Tea Partiers and crazies, but when patriotism marks you as a terrorist or undesirable to declare that you believe in the United States Constitution, that makes you some radical or perceived type of threat. That's frightening, isn't it? Because you'd think, Chuck, that especially as a Christian nation, above all people, we would want our elected representatives to submit to the Constitution because it's constitutional government that has done more to protect Christian liberty than any governing document ever devised by man. I mean, that's frightening, isn't it?
And not just Christian liberty, but all liberty.
But all liberty.
You were talking there, and for a minute you sounded like Barry Goldwater. he was saying that same thing back in the 60s. Yeah, and I think we have to understand, and we didn't get a chance to get to that before we went to the break there a minute ago, but I would have said in conjunction with our discussion on Romans 13 that in our form of government, in our country, we don't have a king. This is not a monarchical system. This is a constitutional republic. And the law of the land is not the president, not the Supreme Court, not the Congress. It is the Constitution. And every single elected representative or official, state, local, or federal, when they take the oath of office, they swear allegiance to the Constitution. So whenever a pastor would say something like that we must submit to BLM, for example, or a presidential dictate, or a gubernatorial dictate, that's something that would be unconstitutional, immoral, unjustified, etc. What they are doing is they are advocating breaking the law, because the Constitution is the law. And no one is above the law, not the governor, not the president, not the court. All of us in a constitutional republic are sworn to uphold the law, and the law is the Constitution. So these pastors are not even thinking it through in that regard, because if they were, they would know that what they are doing is when they say that we're supposed to submit, well, wait a minute. The sheriff is supposed to submit. The police chief is supposed to submit. The governor is supposed to submit. The attorney general is supposed to submit. You know, this is not a monarchy where that the king's word is law. That those that are in trusted office have an obligation to submit to the same laws that we, the citizens, must submit. So even when you look at it in that light, that these pastors that promulgate this submission, no matter what theology, are themselves breaking the law. They accuse us. They say, well, you're breaking the law if the governor or whatever the official is says to do this. But wait a minute. If what the governor or the official, the president, no matter what it is, demands we do, if that is contrary to the law, the Constitution, then they are the lawbreaker. And if we submit to them, then we become lawbreakers. We are maintaining law by supporting the law of the Constitution. So yeah, I think that Bunkerville I think it was a tremendously positive event, and I think that it showed the powers that be that the American people are not going to allow themselves to be subjected to an armed, forced, Gestapo-like federal system that would think that they can freely usurp the liberties, rights, and even the lives of the American citizenry.
Well, you're right. America's supreme law does not rest with any man or group of men. It's the supreme law does not rest with the president, the Congress, or even the Supreme Court. In America, the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And under the laws, every governing official publicly promised to submit to it. But do you think people really understand the significance of the distinction here? And also, would you agree that if we truly believe Romans chapter 13, we would insist and demand that our civil magistrates submit to the U.S. Constitution?
Absolutely we would. Absolutely we would. And unfortunately, in our seminaries and our Bible colleges and universities, this isn't taught, Sheila. That's the problem. They're not taught any of this. I can tell you that in the 3 schools that I attended, this was not taught. The pastors today are not schooled in the historic fundamental principles of the Word of God as it relates to natural law, the rights of man, the jurisdictional authority of government, the sovereignty of God, et cetera, et cetera. They're just not taught it, and for the most part, they're taking their examples from people like Joel Osteen and Rick Warren and men of that nature that have proven that they will do just about anything to have a big church, a big crowd, a big offering, a big building, et cetera, et cetera. And our churches today are, for the most part, corporations. The pastors are CEOs, and they conduct the affairs of the church like a business. And if that's the way you approach the Lord's church, and that's the way you approach your position as a pastor, if you see yourself as a CEO, and you see the church as a corporation, and believe me, the pastors and church officers around America, that's exactly how they view it. They know that under the 501c3 code of the IRS that they're a corporation. And they know that they have obligations and duties relative to the state oversight of their corporation.
Yeah.
And they're very cognizant of that. And we've had here locally, for example, some of our folks in our congregation have run for public office. They've gone around the community and the churches on Sunday and tried to introduce themselves to the congregation and so forth and so on. These are Christian men and women who share all the values that these churches around here say that they believe, etc. But what kind of reception did they get in the church? They got the coldest of shoulder. They would not be allowed to even introduce themselves to the congregation. No recognition of the office that they were seeking, of their own personal character, their convictions. Separation, church and state, we might lose our tax-exempt status, we can't recognize you, et cetera, et cetera. And in at least 2 of the races I'm referring to, our guys lost by a total of 60 votes. 60 votes. If just 1 or maybe 2 of the churches would have given them due recognition and would have just said anything along the lines of, it's great to have this Christian man running for office, and we need to support. They would have easily won. And when you look at, say, well, what's wrong? Why can't we get good people elected? Well, that's the reason. That's the reason we can't get good people elected. The churches and the pastors have completely divorced themselves from the involvement of that which is going to restore the principles that they get up on Sunday and say they believe in. They say they believe in pro-life, and they believe in traditional family and marriage, and they believe in Christian values, and they say all this stuff from the pulpit, and yet whenever there comes an opportunity to support someone that will take those values into the State House or whatever the election might be, they totally ignore them, and not only refuse to support them, but also refuse to allow their congregations to even be introduced to them. We have to look at the church and the pastor to see the reason why we are in the state we're in today.
Well, I absolutely agree. And as we have a minute to wrap up here, I mean, what were your thoughts on the Pope recently reading out of the Quran? And you've got Rick Warrenoff promoting Islam. You've got Joel Osteen and a Mormon leader making statements like, I love the fact that the Pope has made the church more inclusive. I mean, talk about speed railing into a one world religion, just being embraced by all.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think that's the goal of the New World Order elites, is to bring in their doctrine of universalism. Of course, G.W. Bush was a major advocate of that theology. And
yes,
that's seemingly the theology of most of these elites. You cannot have a distinctive faith in the New World Order. You must submit to that doctrine of universalism. And of course, at the head of that faith is none other than the state. It's not the Creator God, it's the state.
That's
and
right.
Really what we're talking about, Sheila, is state worship. State worship.
Absolutely.
We're either going to worship our Creator or we're going to worship the state. And really, that's the choice that each of us has to make.
Well, Chuck, I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for coming on. God bless you. Folks, if you go to weekendvigilante.com, Chuck Baldwin's bio is there along with his website. And we hope to have you on very soon, Chuck. And again, God bless you. Folks, we'll be right back after the break. Thanks, Chuck. We'll be back after the break.